At exactly 11:57 p.m. on New Year's Eve, my phone started vibrating so violently against the stone railing beside me that I thought it might crack the screen. 3 minutes earlier, in a mansion 2 hours south of me, my sister had screamed loud enough to silence a string quartet mid-note. Crystal glasses froze midair. Conversations collapsed. And the Harrington name, the name printed on towers, office parks, and luxury developments across Arizona, began to fracture in real time. My father had been standing beneath a custom Italian chandelier when the first document appeared on the 75-inch display in his living room. He didn't blink, he didn't speak, he just stared, because the signature on the screen was his, and he knew exactly what it meant. The last thing he shouted before dialing my number was, "Blair, where are you?" I let the phone vibrate 3 times before answering. "Did everyone enjoy my gift?" I asked. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice that no longer sounded powerful. "What did you do?" I looked up at the Sedona sky as fireworks began rising in slow arcs above the canyon walls. "I didn't do anything," I replied calmly. "I stopped you. My name is Blair Harrington. I'm 28 years old. I work with clay, heat, pressure, and time. And according to my family, that made me the weakest Harrington. They built skylines. I built vessels. They negotiated land acquisitions. I negotiated glaze temperatures. They measured success in square footage. I measured it in millimeters. And for most of my life, I believed their version of me, the sensitive one, the impractical one, the one who didn't understand how the real world works. What they didn't understand is that clay remembers pressure. And so do people. This didn't start on New Year's Eve. It started 10 days earlier when my mother used a word she had never used with me before. Need. Her message was short. Come home early. This will be the biggest New Year's celebration we've ever hosted. I need you here. My mother does not need. She organizes. She commands. She orchestrates. But she does not need. I stared at the message for almost an hour before replying with a simple, "I'll be there." I packed a small bag, wrapped a hand-thrown obsidian bowl in linen, and drove north. The desert changes as you approach Scottsdale. The air feels curated. The roads feel intentional. Natural becomes landscaped. Wild becomes controlled. The Harrington estate sits on elevated land overlooking a valley designed to look untouched. Glass walls, polished limestone, symmetry. It isn't a home. It's a statement. When I pulled into the circular drive, event crews were already assembling structures for fireworks. White tents stretched across half the lawn. Floral installations taller than I am lined the entrance. Servers practiced synchronized tray movement. This wasn't a family celebration. It was branding. Maria opened the door before I knocked. She hugged me tightly. No one else in that house ever initiated touch first. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. Her tone carried something heavier than hospitality. Inside, the house felt colder, not temperature, energy. Walls had been repainted in muted tones. Art had been replaced with abstract minimalism. My childhood bedroom was gone. In its place stood a frosted glass door labeled Executive Fitness Suite. 18 years reduced to square footage efficiency. "Space optimization," my mother said when she noticed me looking. She wore cream slacks and held a tablet in one hand. Everything about her was precision. "I brought something for Dad," I said, holding up the wrapped bowl. "Leave it by the console." He's in the study with Ryan and Nicole. Her voice didn't ask how my drive was, didn't ask how my studio was doing, didn't ask anything. I walked down the hallway lined with framed magazine covers featuring my father shaking hands with mayors. The study door was slightly open. I raised my hand to knock, and then I heard my name. "Blair needs to face reality eventually," my father said. His voice carried that calm authority investors loved. "That pottery hobby won't sustain her long term." Ryan's voice followed, smooth, polished. "We present her the numbers on New Year's Eve, full audience, family, partners, witnesses." Nicole laughed softly. "And we have her sign the relinquishment right there." Relinquishment. The word hit harder than insult ever could. A man I didn't recognize flipped through papers. "Once she signs, the trust amendment activates. Offshore transfers are already secured." My heart slowed. "How much has been moved?" Ryan asked. 28 million. Silence. Then my father, "We can't risk her challenging it later." Nicole's tone sharpened. "She won't. She doesn't understand structures." They weren't planning a job offer. They were planning erasure. Publicly, offer me a controlled salary, frame it as generosity, have me surrender permanent equity in front of witnesses, and call it support. "After she signs," my father concluded, "clear her remaining belongings from storage." I stepped back before they saw me. The bowl in my hands felt heavier than stone. I didn't knock. I didn't confront them. I walked out, got in my Jeep, and drove. Halfway to Phoenix, I pulled onto the shoulder of the highway. The desert stretched endless and indifferent around me. I allowed myself 7 minutes. 7 minutes to grieve something that had probably never existed. Then I stopped, because clay doesn't crack from pressure. It cracks from uneven heat, and I was done being uneven. I called Sarah. 3 years earlier, I noticed discrepancies in estate conversations, casual remarks that didn't align with filings. So I hired a forensic accounting firm quietly, not because I wanted conflict, because I wanted clarity. We tracked Friday afternoon wire transfers, shell entities registered offshore, draft trust amendments that never reached formal family discussion. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to watch. Now I had confirmation of intent. Back in Phoenix, I unlocked my studio close to midnight. The smell of clay grounded me instantly. I opened the safe beneath my work table, spread every document across the surface where I usually shaped vessels. Wire confirmations, entity structures, draft trust revisions removing my name. And here's what my family never knew. My studio wasn't failing. Last year's gross revenue was just over 800,000. This year was projected at 1.4 million. Private collectors, international commissions, museum interest. I never told them because I never needed their applause. At 3:17 a.m., I made a decision. If they wanted spectacle, I would give them documentation. For the next 8 days, I worked methodically. Certified copies, notarized confirmations, cross-referenced transfers. I retained a tax attorney to ensure compliance. Filed formal documentation with appropriate oversight channels. Everything legal, everything precise. Then I commissioned a custom black walnut box, laser-etched with the Harrington crest. Heavy, elegant, unmistakable. Inside, I placed 2 encrypted drives, a bound binder of financial trails, and a single letter. "You taught me presentation is everything. Consider this mine." delivery scheduled for December 31st. 11:30 p.m. signature required. New Year's Eve arrived in curated sunlight. Guests began arriving before dusk. Investors, developers, political connections, women in gowns designed to be photographed, men who measured worth in acreage. I was not there. Instead, I stood barefoot on a terrace in Sedona with 10 people who had never once asked me to be different. We cooked together, laughed, watched the desert turn indigo. At 11:30 p.m., the courier placed the box in the center of my parents' living room. It was too refined to ignore. At 11:47, curiosity overpowered arrogance. At 11:52, the first document appeared on their television screen. Wire transfers, offshore registrations, trust amendments removing my name, IRS acknowledgement receipts. The room fell silent, music stopped, conversations collapsed, and by 11:57 my phone began to vibrate. Nicole called first, declined, Ryan declined. My mother declined, finally my father. I answered. "What have you done?" he demanded. "Nothing," I replied calmly. "I preserved what was mine." Behind me, Sedona fireworks began rising into the sky, bright, measured, unapologetic. Inside that mansion, for the first time in decades, the Harrington name wasn't the loudest thing in the room. Truth was, he didn't respond immediately. For a man who built an empire on decisive language, silence did not suit him. I could hear muffled voices behind him. Nicole's sharp panic, Ryan's controlled urgency, the low hum of guests trying not to stare at a screen that had just turned celebration into exposure. "You've made a mistake," my father finally said. "No," I answered. "You did 10 days ago." The line went dead. Midnight arrived in 2 different worlds at the same time. In Sedona, fireworks bloomed across open sky, their reflections dissolving into red rock and darkness. Laughter rose around me, warm, uncomplicated. In Scottsdale, champagne glasses remained untouched, and investors began quietly recalculating their proximity to my last name. I stayed outside long after the noise settled. Not because I was afraid of what would happen next, but because I knew something irreversible had just occurred. For years, I had tried to be included. That night, I chose to be separate. The next morning, my phone contained 27 missed calls and a series of messages that moved through predictable stages. Outrage, denial, bargaining, accusation, finally restrained negotiation. Ryan's message was the most clinical. "We need to discuss this internally before it escalates further." Internally. As if I hadn't been internal once, I didn't reply. By noon, business news feeds were already hinting at regulatory reviews connected to one of the Harrington holding entities. Nothing explosive. Just enough to signal that something was being examined. Investors hate uncertainty more than loss. It spreads faster. Over the next week, conversations happened in rooms I was no longer invited to. Auditors requested clarification. Partners asked for documentation. Some alliances held. Others quietly dissolved. Reputation doesn't collapse in a single headline. It erodes through raised eyebrows and unanswered emails. My mother called on the 4th day. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "Blair, this didn't have to happen publicly." "You plan to remove me publicly," I said. "That was different." "How?" A pause. She didn't answer because there wasn't one. "You embarrassed your father." "No," I replied calmly. I prevented him from embarrassing me. Silence again, then a softer tone. You could have come to us. I did, I said. For years, you just never listened. She ended the call without saying goodbye. Meanwhile, my own world remained structured and grounded. I returned to my studio the day after New Year's Day and resumed throwing clay on the wheel. There's something stabilizing about repetition, centering the mass, applying steady pressure, feeling form rise between your hands. Clay does not care about inheritance disputes or board meetings. It responds only to balance. Sarah kept me informed on legal developments. Because I had filed documentation through proper channels before the New Year's Eve disclosure, everything remained procedural, not reckless. The distinction mattered. I hadn't acted out of vengeance. I had acted out of preservation. 2 weeks later, Ryan appeared at my studio unannounced. He stood in the doorway wearing a tailored charcoal coat, surveying the space as if evaluating commercial potential. The studio was airy but modest. White walls, concrete floors, shelves lined with half-finished pieces drying in stages of completion. "You've done well," he said, not quite looking at me. "Yes," I replied, continuing to shape the bowl in front of me. He watched my hands for a moment. "You've complicated things. I clarified them. You blindsided us. You underestimated me." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what this does to the company? Do you know what you were about to do to me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted tactics. "We could fix this, restructure, quiet settlements, revisions." "You already tried revising me out," I said. "I'm not interested in revisions." He exhaled sharply. "You've always been dramatic." "No," I corrected gently. "You've always been comfortable." He left without shaking my hand. That night, I stood alone in the studio after closing and considered the strange calm settling inside me. I had expected guilt, or fear, or triumph. Instead, I felt clarity. 4 weeks after New Year's Eve, a formal review notice became public. Not scandal review. The language was careful, but careful language still shifts stock confidence. A few mid-level partners exited their agreements. A development project paused pending clarification. My father did not call again. Nicole sent one final message. "You've destroyed your own safety net." I stared at the words for a long time. Safety net. It had never been a net. It had been a leash. The irony was almost elegant. In attempting to remove me quietly, they had exposed the very structures they hoped to protect. If they had left me alone, if they had simply allowed the original trust structure to stand, none of it would have escalated. Control breeds risk. Distance breeds strength. In early spring, I received an invitation from a respected New York gallery. They had seen my recent series and were interested in a solo exhibition. The theme they suggested was legacy. I smiled at the timing. I titled the collection Imprint. Each piece explored pressure lines, visible marks left intentionally in the clay surface rather than smoothed away. Imperfections preserved instead of hidden. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. During installation week in New York, I walked through the empty gallery alone before opening night. The space smelled faintly of paint and dust. My sculptures stood on pedestals beneath controlled lighting, their shadows sharp against white walls. For the first time, I felt fully independent of my surname. Opening night drew collectors, critics, and curators. Conversations centered on texture, resilience, permanence. No one mentioned real estate. No one asked about family connections. My work existed on its own merit. Halfway through the evening, Sarah texted me a brief update. Settlement discussions underway. You are not required. I slipped my phone back into my bag and returned to a conversation about kiln temperatures. Months passed. The Harrington name remained visible but quieter. Fewer public announcements. More conservative positioning. The empire had not collapsed, it had recalibrated. Wealth rarely vanishes, it reshapes. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer monitored financial reports tied to my childhood address. I no longer wondered whether I should attend holiday gatherings. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Maria sent me a short message one afternoon. "I'm proud of you." It meant more than any investor reassurance ever could. In late summer, a certified envelope arrived at my Phoenix address. The return name belonged to my father's legal counsel. I placed it unopened on my kitchen counter and left it there for 3 days. On the 4th day, I wrote "Return to sender" across the front and dropped it in the mailbox. Closure doesn't require dialogue. It requires decision. Sometimes I replay that moment at 11:57 p.m. The vibration of my phone, the desert wind against my face, the realization that everything I had been told about myself was incomplete. They believed I lacked business instinct because I chose art. They believed I lacked resilience because I avoided confrontation. They believed I lacked awareness because I didn't argue. They mistook restraint for ignorance. They mistook quiet for weakness. What they never understood is that patience can be strategic. Clay collapses when forced too quickly, but under measured pressure, it holds form. I didn't destroy my family. I removed myself from a structure that was already cracking. The last time I drove past the Scottsdale estate, months later, the gates were still polished. The lawn still manicured. The house still imposing against desert sky. But it no longer felt like mine. And that was the point. I no longer needed a room there. I no longer needed acknowledgement. I no longer needed to prove that building vessels from earth could coexist with building towers from steel. At 11:57 p.m., illusion met evidence. At midnight, identity separated from expectation. And somewhere between clay and fire, I understood something my family never did. Legacy isn't what you control. It's what survives without you. I chose to survive, and that was enough.